Get your hands off me. Her voice was firm, but the tremble in it betrayed her fear. The officer didn't flinch. Instead, his grip tightened, and his eyes burned with disdain as if her mere presence offended him. The parking lot of the elementary school was nearly empty, except for a few lingering parents and teachers who had stopped to watch the scene unfold. The humiliation was as loud as the scuffing of her shoes against the pavement when he shoved her back. "You don't belong here," he hissed, stepping closer, towering over her. His uniform shone under the fading daylight, a symbol of authority he seemed to relish. "And I'm not going to tell you again, get on the ground." She didn't move. She couldn't. Her mind raced. How had this escalated so quickly? 1 minute she was standing up for her son, calling out the inappropriate comments a staff member had made about his hair, and the next, this officer had shown up. No questions asked. No room for explanations. He had looked at her skin, and decided she was a threat. "I said down." His voice snapped her back to reality as he reached for his baton, and before she could react, her knees hit the ground hard. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. "This is a mistake," she said, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. "I'm not, shut up." The baton slammed against the asphalt next to her hand, making her flinch. "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place? Like you're better than the law?" "I am the law," she wanted to scream, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't say it, not yet. Not while her son stood just a few feet away, frozen in place, his wide eyes locked on her crumpled form. She couldn't make this worse for him. She had to endure this, for now. "You're under arrest," he barked, pulling her up roughly by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "For trespassing and resisting an officer." Resisting? She hadn't even touched him. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered. The crowd was too scared to intervene, too unsure of what they were seeing. And he knew it. He smirked as he dragged her toward the patrol car, ignoring her protests and the few murmurs from the onlookers. "Please," she said again, softer this time, her voice cracking. "I'm not what you think I am." "No." His laugh was sharp and bitter. "You're just another criminal pretending to be something you're not. And it's my job to remind people like you of their place." Her place. That's what this was about. Her place. As if the color of her skin defined where she belonged. As if no matter what she had accomplished, no matter how hard she had worked, she would always be reduced to this in his eyes, someone unworthy of respect. She swallowed hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Not here. Not now. But the ache in her chest was unbearable. The weight of the stares, the whispers, the disbelief. She could feel her dignity being stripped away with every step. And yet, something inside her refused to break. Because this wasn't the end. Not for her. Not for her son, who was still standing there, watching. And not for him, the man who thought he could humiliate her without consequence. He didn't know who she was. Not yet. But he was about to find out. When the truth came out, it wouldn't just shatter his perception of her. It would shatter his entire career. And the fallout? It would leave everyone speechless. But how do you take down a man who hides behind a badge? How do you fight back without becoming the villain in their eyes? Stay with this story and see what happens when the tables turn, and justice finally gets served. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. This channel is a safe space where stories are told to inspire, empower, and spark important conversations. We believe in justice, equality, and the power of change. To every Black viewer watching this, your voice matters, your story matters, and your life matters. We hope this story resonates with you and leaves a lasting impact. If you enjoy it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our work. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. The air outside Pine Ridge Elementary School was crisp, the early morning sun casting long shadows over the pavement. Parents shuffled in and out of the parking lot, rushing to drop off their children before heading to work. Among them was Danielle Carter, a woman whose presence often commanded attention without her even trying. Tall, poised, and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, she moved with purpose. Her dark skin glowed under the morning light, and her sharp features carried an air of authority that many couldn't quite place at first glance. Yet, there was warmth in her eyes, a softness reserved for moments like this, as she leaned down to fix her son's collar. "Remember what we talked about, Jamal. Keep your head up, no matter what anyone says," she said, smoothing down the edges of his shirt. Jamal nodded, though his small shoulders were tense. At just 8 years old, he was already learning lessons most kids his age never had to think about. His curly hair had been the center of yesterday's argument. A teacher had made an offhand comment about it being too wild and distracting, sparking Danielle's decision to come in person and address the issue. She wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when it came to her son. "I'll be right inside if you need me," she reassured him, giving his shoulder a squeeze before watching him disappear through the school's double doors. Inside the building, the hum of morning activity filled the halls. Danielle walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she approached the front desk. She was here to meet with the principal, to demand an explanation and ensure that nothing like this happened again. But even as she waited, flipping through a visitor sign-in sheet, she could feel the stares, the subtle glances, the quick looks exchanged between staff members. It wasn't paranoia. She knew how people saw her. Too sharp. Too confident. Too out of place in a predominantly white neighborhood like this. Meanwhile, just outside the building, Officer Bradley Watts leaned against his patrol car, sipping his coffee. He scanned the parking lot out of habit, his eyes narrowing slightly when they landed on Danielle's sleek black sedan. It wasn't the kind of car he often saw parked here. Too expensive. Too polished. His gaze shifted toward the front entrance, where he'd spotted her earlier, and his jaw tightened. She didn't belong here. At least, that's what his gut told him. And Bradley Watts always trusted his gut. Watts had been on the force for over a decade. He prided himself on keeping order, on knowing the difference between right and wrong. But his version of wrong often carried a face, a color, an assumption he couldn't shake. In his mind, he wasn't a bad man, just cautious. Protective. Someone who didn't let things slide. He adjusted his belt, the weight of his badge and gun grounding him as he started toward the building. The call had come through earlier about a disturbance involving a parent, and Watts had already made up his mind about who it was before even stepping inside. Danielle was seated across from the principal when Watts entered, his presence shifting the energy in the room instantly. Her back straightened, and her eyes locked onto his. She recognized that look, the one that said he had already judged her. "Is there a problem here?" Watts asked, his voice steady but sharp. Before Danielle could respond, the principal, a nervous man with thinning hair, jumped in. "Officer Watts, I don't think we need, I'll handle it," Watts cut him off, his eyes never leaving Danielle. Danielle stood slowly, refusing to let him intimidate her. "I don't know what this is about, but I'm here to speak with the principal about an issue concerning my son. That's all." Watts stepped closer. "And you are?" "Danielle Carter." "That doesn't tell me much." "It should," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension growing in the room. Watts smirked, though there was no humor in it. "I'm going to need to see some ID." Danielle's fingers twitched at her side. She knew where this was headed, but she forced herself to stay calm as she reached into her bag and pulled out her wallet. Watts took it, his eyes scanning the card before handing it back without so much as a nod. "Is there a reason I'm being treated like a suspect?" she asked. "Just doing my job," he said, though his tone made it clear he didn't believe she belonged there. The tension thickened, pressing in on Danielle from all sides. The principal's uneasy shifting. Watts' looming presence. The faint sounds of children laughing in the distance, oblivious to the storm brewing inside these walls. "I think we're done here," Danielle said, turning to the principal. "I'll follow up with the superintendent." But before she could take a step, Watts' hand landed on her arm. "Not so fast." Danielle froze, her body going rigid. "Let go of me. You need to calm down," Watts said, tightening his grip. "Calm down." Her voice rose now, no longer able to hide the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't made a scene. I'm here because my son was mistreated, and now I'm the one being treated like a criminal." Watts' eyes darkened. "You're resisting." And just like that, the situation spiraled. The next moments were a blur, his hand yanking her backward, her heels slipping against the tile, the sharp crack of her knee hitting the floor. Gasps echoed from the hallway as the office door swung open. Danielle's breath came in sharp bursts, but she refused to cry. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Watts towered over her now, his voice low and full of contempt. "You think you're better than everyone else? Walking in here like you own the place? Let me remind you of something, you don't." For the first time, Danielle's composure cracked, her voice trembling but still strong. "You have no idea who I am." Watts leaned in, his smirk widening. "And I don't care." But he would care. Soon. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. And when the truth came out, it would shatter everything he thought he knew, not just about her, but about himself. Danielle sat in the dimly lit conference room, her fingers clenched around the edge of the table. The sting on her knee had dulled, but the humiliation burned hotter with every passing second. Across the table, the principal sat stiffly, his eyes darting nervously between her and the officer leaning against the wall. Watts' arms were crossed, his presence suffocating the room. His smug expression hadn't faded, and the tension only thickened as Danielle exhaled slowly, trying to ground herself. "You're not listening to me," she said, her voice measured but sharp. "This isn't about causing a scene. This is about my son being targeted, and now I'm being treated like I don't even have the right to stand up for him." Watts pushed off the wall, his boots thudding against the floor as he approached the table. "And I'm telling you, ma'am, that you escalated the situation the moment you refused to cooperate." "Cooperate?" Danielle snapped, her eyes locking onto his. "You grabbed me. You shoved me. In front of my son." Watts' eyes narrowed. "And maybe if you'd listened the first time, none of that would have happened." Danielle stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. "Do you even hear yourself? Do you even understand what you did?" Her voice trembled, but she refused to let it falter completely. "You humiliated me. You humiliated my son. And you think I'm just going to let that go?" Watts leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You don't scare me. People like you never do. People like me." Danielle's voice hardened, but the principal interjected quickly, his voice shaky. "Let's not let this get out of hand. Ms. Carter, I think it's best if we just take a moment." "No," Danielle said firmly, her gaze never leaving Watts. "I'm not taking a moment. I'm not stepping back. I want answers, and I want accountability." Watts smirked. "You can want whatever you like, lady. But let me remind you, you're not in charge here." The words lingered, heavy and deliberate. Danielle felt the heat rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, slamming it onto the table. "You'll regret saying that." The principal flinched, but Watts didn't move, his confidence unwavering. Danielle opened the folder and pushed a document toward the principal. "This is a formal complaint. Against you." She turned to Watts. "And against him. I expect it to be filed immediately." Watts leaned back slightly, his smirk fading just enough to reveal the slightest crack in his armor. You think a piece of paper is going to scare me? Danielle stepped closer, her voice low. Not yet. The tension hung heavy as Watts stared at her, searching her face for any sign of weakness. But there was none. And for the first time, his confidence wavered. Danielle turned and walked out, leaving them in stunned silence. Outside, she leaned against the wall, her hands shaking. She hated that he had gotten to her, that he had made her feel small even for a moment. But this wasn't over. Not even close. Hours later, Danielle sat in her car outside the police station, her phone pressed to her ear. I need to talk to someone in internal affairs, she said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. The receptionist transferred her, and soon a deep, authoritative voice came on the line. This is Captain Reynolds. How can I help you? Danielle hesitated for just a second before speaking. I need to report misconduct involving an officer. What kind of misconduct? Assault. Harassment. Abuse of power, she said, each word sharper than the last. The captain's tone shifted. I'll need details. You'll get them, she said. But first, I need to make one thing clear, I'm not going to let this get buried. We don't bury cases like this, he replied, but Danielle wasn't convinced. She'd seen it happen before. Well, let's hope that's true. The next few days moved in a blur. Statements were taken. Reports were filed. But Danielle could feel the pushback already, the way officers watched her when she walked through the station, the whispers that followed her down the hallways. She expected it. She was ready for it. But it still stung. Watts, on the other hand, carried himself like nothing had happened. He continued patrolling the neighborhood, flashing smiles and shaking hands as if he hadn't just thrown a woman to the ground days earlier. Danielle watched from a distance, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. Late one evening, she sat alone in her office, staring at the file in front of her. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a message from an unknown number. You should back off before this gets worse for you. Danielle's heart skipped, but she quickly composed herself. She didn't scare easily. The next morning, she pulled into the school parking lot again, this time dressed in plain clothes. No suit. No badge. She wanted them to underestimate her. She needed them to. Watts was there, standing by his car, laughing with another officer. He saw her approach, and his smirk returned. Back again. Danielle stopped in front of him, her eyes steady. You're going to regret what you did. Is that a threat? No, she said. It's a promise. She turned and walked into the building, her heels clicking against the pavement. Watts watched her go, but for the first time, there was no smirk. Just unease. Inside, Danielle could feel the tension thickening around her. The principal looked nervous, the teachers avoided her gaze, and the whispers followed her everywhere. But she kept her head high. Because the storm was coming. And when it hit, it wouldn't just shake Watts. It would shatter him. The air inside the station felt heavier than usual, the hum of conversations and the clatter of keyboards fading into the background as Danielle stepped through the glass doors. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, each step deliberate, each movement calculated. She wasn't nervous, not outwardly, but there was a storm brewing inside her, a swirling mix of anger, determination, and something else she couldn't quite name. She kept her head high, shoulders squared, as if the weight of what was about to happen wasn't pressing down on her chest. Eyes followed her as she walked deeper into the station, passing desks cluttered with papers and half-empty coffee cups. Officers looked up, some out of curiosity, others with a flicker of recognition that quickly turned into whispered comments. Danielle ignored them. She wasn't here to make friends, and she certainly wasn't here to ease their discomfort. She had a mission, and nothing was going to stop her. At the far end of the room, Bradley Watts sat at his desk, leaning back in his chair with the kind of ease that only came from someone who felt untouchable. He laughed at something another officer said, his voice cutting through the noise and making Danielle's skin crawl. For a moment, she just stood there, watching him. He looked so at home, so confident, like he belonged in this place more than anyone else. And maybe that was what made her angriest of all. Watts turned, finally noticing her. His expression shifted the moment their eyes met, the smirk on his face freezing before he covered it with forced indifference. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk as if inviting her to speak. Danielle didn't give him the satisfaction of a greeting. Instead, she crossed the room, her heels echoing louder with each step until she stopped directly in front of his desk. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the noise around them. Watts leaned back again, that smirk creeping back onto his face as he folded his arms across his chest. "I'm busy." "No," Danielle said, her tone unwavering. "You're not." His eyes flicked to the other officers, then back to her. The smirk faltered, just for a second, before he stood and towered over her. "This isn't the time or the place." Danielle's gaze didn't waver. "Then let's find one that is." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward one of the empty conference rooms. She didn't have to look back to know that Watts was following her. She could hear his heavy footsteps, the deliberate way he dragged his boots against the floor like he was trying to make her feel his presence. She didn't care. Let him try to intimidate her. It wasn't going to work. The door clicked shut behind them, cutting off the noise of the station. For a moment, there was only silence. Watts stood near the door, arms crossed, his expression hard. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he said finally, his voice low. "But this is harassment." Danielle reached into her bag, pulling out a thick folder and slapping it onto the table between them. "Sit down." Watts didn't move. He just stared at her, his jaw tightening. "I said sit down," Danielle repeated, her voice sharper now. After a long pause, Watts dropped into the chair, his posture tense and defensive. Danielle flipped the folder open, pulling out a stack of documents and photos, spreading them across the table with deliberate movements. She could see the flicker of unease in his eyes as he scanned the papers, but he tried to mask it with another smirk. "What is this supposed to be?" Watts asked, though his voice didn't have the confidence it had moments earlier. Danielle leaned in slightly, her eyes locked on his. "This is everything you thought you buried." Watts scoffed, but it sounded forced. "You think a couple of reports are going to scare me?" Danielle slid another paper toward him. "This isn't just a couple of reports. It's a pattern. A long one. Complaints. Internal investigations that were shut down before they even started. Evidence that conveniently disappeared. And guess what? It's all here." Watts's face hardened, but there was no hiding the flicker of panic in his eyes. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice was quieter now. Danielle smirked, mirroring the expression he had worn so many times before. "Am I? Or are you finally realizing that the walls are closing in?" Watts pushed back in his chair, his hands gripping the edges of the table. "This is ridiculous. You don't have anything." Danielle didn't flinch. She pulled out another sheet of paper and laid it in front of him. "This," she said, "is the official internal investigation report. It was opened the moment you put your hands on me. Statements have been taken. Witnesses have been interviewed. And the best part?" She paused, letting the words sink in before delivering the blow. "It's all on video." Watts's face drained of color. "What?" Danielle's voice didn't waver. "Every second of what you did was recorded. And it's being reviewed as we speak." Watts stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You think you can ruin me?" Danielle stepped closer, her voice low and sharp. "I don't think, I know." Watts's breathing quickened. "You don't get it. This isn't just about me. If you go through with this, it's going to blow back on you. Your reputation, your career, none of it will survive this kind of fight. Danielle didn't blink. You're wrong, she said. Because I'm not the one who's been hiding skeletons. I'm not the one who's spent years abusing power and covering it up. That's all you. Watts clenched his fists, his voice shaking now. You don't know what you're doing. Danielle's eyes didn't leave his. I know exactly what I'm doing. Watts pointed a finger at her. You'll regret this. No, Danielle said, her voice steady. You will. She turned and walked out of the room without looking back, her heels echoing down the hallway. She could feel the stairs as she passed, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. But she didn't stop. Because this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. And when the truth came out, it wouldn't just destroy Watts. It would expose everything he stood for. The hallway outside the conference room was eerily quiet, but Danielle's pulse pounded loud in her ears. She didn't stop walking. Not even when she heard the door swing open behind her and the heavy footsteps of Bradley Watts charging after her. She knew he wasn't finished. He couldn't leave it there. His pride wouldn't allow it. She reached the far end of the hallway, but before she could step into the main lobby, his voice stopped her cold. You're not walking out of here like this, Watts hissed, low enough that no one else could hear but sharp enough to make her blood run hot. Danielle turned slowly, keeping her expression neutral, though her fists clenched at her sides. Like what? She asked, her voice steady but edged with steel. Like you've already won, Watts snapped, his jaw tight. You think this is over? You think that little folder of yours is enough to take me down? Danielle took a step closer, closing the gap between them, her heels clicking against the floor like gunshots. It's not a matter of what I think, Watts. It's a matter of what I know. And I know the truth. That's more than enough to bring you down. His eyes darkened, the flicker of panic she'd seen earlier now bubbling to the surface. You don't know what you're getting yourself into, he said, his voice low and strained. You don't get how this works. You're walking into something bigger than you can handle. Danielle didn't blink. Bigger than me, she said, her voice rising just enough to make him shift uncomfortably. No, Watts. This is exactly my size. I've spent my entire life preparing for men like you, and you're not as big as you think you are. He stepped closer, invading her space, but she didn't back down. You think your badge is going to protect you, he growled. Danielle's eyes burned, but she kept her voice calm. You're damn right it will. Because unlike you, I earned mine. I didn't hide behind it. I didn't abuse it. And I sure as hell didn't use it as a weapon against the people I swore to protect. Watts's breath quickened, and for the first time, his composure cracked. You don't get it, he said, his voice breaking slightly. This job isn't what you think it is. You follow the rules. You get left behind. You step out of line. You get crushed. I did what I had to do to survive. Danielle leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper but sharp enough to cut through him. No. You did what you wanted to do. You used that badge to feed your ego, to make yourself feel powerful. And now? You're terrified because you know that power's about to be ripped away. Watts's face twisted, but before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Both of them turned to see Captain Reynolds approaching, his expression unreadable. Danielle stepped back, letting Watts breathe for a moment, but her eyes never left him. Is there a problem here? Reynolds asked, looking between them. Watts straightened quickly, his mask snapping back into place. No problem, Captain. Just clearing up a misunderstanding. Reynolds didn't look convinced. His gaze lingered on Danielle, searching her expression for clues. Are you sure about that? Reynolds asked, his voice firm. Danielle didn't hesitate. Not at all, Captain. In fact, I was just about to bring something to your attention, something you'll want to see. Watts's head snapped toward her, his eyes widening. "You don't have to do this," he said quickly, his voice lower now, desperate. Danielle didn't respond. She reached into her bag and pulled out a flash drive, holding it up for Reynolds to see. "This," she said, "is the footage from the school. The footage that shows exactly what happened. I'd like to request that it be reviewed immediately." Reynolds's eyes narrowed as he took the drive from her. "I'll take care of it," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Watts's breathing quickened. "Captain, this is ridiculous. She's twisting this entire thing." Reynolds raised a hand, cutting him off. "Enough, Watts." Danielle stepped back, letting the scene unfold. Watts turned to her, his voice a harsh whisper. "You don't know what you've started." Danielle's eyes burned with determination. "No, Watts. I know exactly what I've started. And I'm not stopping until it's finished." Reynolds gestured for Danielle to follow him, leaving Watts standing in the hallway, his face pale and his fists clenched at his sides. Danielle didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel his anger radiating behind her, but she didn't care. In Reynolds's office, the silence stretched as he plugged in the flash drive. Danielle sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as the video began to play. The sound of Watts's voice filled the room, sharp, condescending, and unmistakable. The image of him grabbing her arm, shoving her to the ground, played out on the screen. Reynolds's expression darkened as he watched, his jaw tightening with each passing second. When the video ended, Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy as they met hers. "This is bad," he said, his voice low. Danielle's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "It's worse than bad, Captain. And it's not just this incident. There's more." Reynolds looked at her, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that looked like regret. "I'll handle it," he said finally. Danielle didn't move. "I need more than that," she said. "I need guarantees. I need to know he won't walk away from this." Reynolds nodded slowly. "He won't." Danielle let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, but the tension didn't leave her body. She knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Reynolds stood and opened the door, motioning for someone to come in. Two officers stepped inside, their eyes darting nervously toward Danielle before focusing on Reynolds. "Take Officer Watts into custody," Reynolds said, his voice sharp. Danielle didn't flinch, but her heart raced as the officers nodded and left the room. She could hear the commotion outside, the raised voices, the heavy footsteps. And then it was quiet again. Reynolds looked at her. "You did the right thing." Danielle met his gaze. "I know." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And what came next would be the hardest battle of all. Danielle sat in the dimly lit office, her fingers tapping lightly against the arm of the chair as she stared at the blank wall in front of her. The room was quiet, but her thoughts were deafening. The sound of Watts's voice, the echo of his threats, and the image of his face when the officers took him away were all burned into her memory. She could still feel the tension in the air, the disbelief in his eyes as the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. Not yet. Not with everything still hanging in the balance. Reynolds entered the room, closing the door softly behind him. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her stomach tighten. He dropped a file onto the desk and leaned back against the edge of it, crossing his arms. "It's done," he said, his voice low. "Watts has been processed and booked. Official charges have been filed: assault, misconduct, abuse of power." He paused, watching her carefully. "But it's not going to be easy from here." Danielle straightened in her chair, her shoulders tightening. "I didn't expect it to be easy," she said. Reynolds sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You should know there's already talk, officers questioning the investigation, rumors spreading. Some of them don't think this should have gone this far. Danielle's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. And what do you think? Reynolds hesitated, and for a moment, she thought he might deflect, but then he met her gaze. I think it should have happened a long time ago. But that doesn't change the fact that people are going to fight this. They're going to defend him, no matter what the evidence says. Danielle leaned forward. So what are you saying? That I should back down? No, Reynolds said quickly, his voice firm. I'm saying you need to be prepared. Watts has connections, people who've covered for him before. People who won't hesitate to do it again. Danielle exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. I've come too far to back down now. Reynolds nodded, but there was tension in his posture. I'm on your side, but you need to be smart about this. You've made enemies, Danielle. Powerful ones. Danielle stood, her heels clicking against the floor as she crossed the room. She turned back to face him, her eyes steady. Enemies don't scare me, Captain. What scares me is letting this go and allowing someone like him to keep hurting people. Reynolds's expression softened, and for the first time, she saw the weight he carried, the exhaustion of trying to balance justice with politics. Just promise me you'll be careful. Danielle gave a small nod, but her mind was already racing. The drive home felt longer than usual, the streets darker, the shadows stretching farther than they should have. Her knuckles tightened around the steering wheel as her thoughts spiraled. She replayed every moment, Watts's defiance, his desperation, and the crack in his voice when he realized the walls were closing in. But even with him in custody, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Her heart skipped. She hesitated before answering, keeping her voice steady. Danielle Carter. The line crackled for a moment before a distorted voice came through. You think you've won, don't you? Her stomach dropped, but she didn't let it show. Who is this? A soft laugh echoed through the speaker, low and menacing. You don't get it yet, do you? Watts isn't the only one who's untouchable. Danielle's grip on the wheel tightened. Whoever this is, you're making a mistake. This doesn't scare me. You should be scared, the voice replied. Because this is far from over. The line went dead. Danielle stared at the screen, her breath shallow, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to let fear take over, not now. She pulled into her driveway, locking the doors the moment the engine shut off. Her hands trembled as she reached for her bag, but she shook it off and stepped inside, locking the door behind her. Jamal was waiting in the living room, his eyes wide the moment she walked in. Mom. Are you okay? Danielle knelt down, cupping his face gently. I'm fine, baby, she said softly, even though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. Everything's going to be okay. But Jamal didn't look convinced. I heard some kids talking about what happened, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They said the police arrested someone. Danielle hesitated, not wanting to scare him, but she knew she couldn't lie. They did. And it was the right thing to do. Is he going to come back? Jamal's voice wavered, and Danielle's heart ached. No, she said firmly. He's not coming back. I promise. Jamal nodded, but the fear in his eyes lingered. Danielle hugged him tightly, silently vowing to keep that promise no matter what it took. Later that night, Danielle sat at her kitchen table, files spread out in front of her. She couldn't sleep, not with everything still so unsettled. The phone call haunted her, and every noise outside made her flinch. She knew this wasn't just about Watts anymore. It was bigger than him. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Reynolds. She answered quickly. We need to talk, he said, his voice tense. Tell me. There's pressure to make this go away, Reynolds said. From above. They're saying there's not enough evidence to make the charges stick. Danielle's chest tightened. You saw the video, Reynolds. Don't tell me that wasn't enough. It is for me, he said. But I'm not the one calling the shots. There's talk about cutting a deal, letting him walk with a suspension instead of jail time. No, Danielle snapped, standing up and pacing the kitchen. Absolutely not. He doesn't get to walk away from this. Danielle, I'm on your side, but you need to listen to me, Reynolds said, his voice low. They're coming after you. They're digging into your record, looking for anything they can use to discredit you. Danielle's pulse quickened. Let them dig. They won't find anything. They don't need to, Reynolds said. All they need is doubt. You're not just fighting Watts, you're fighting the system that protected him. And they don't go down without a fight. Danielle clenched her jaw. Then I'll fight harder. The next morning, Danielle arrived at the station earlier than usual. She could feel the stares, the whispered conversations as she walked through the halls. She didn't stop. She pushed open Reynolds's door without knocking, slamming a stack of papers onto his desk. I want a formal statement released, she said, her voice sharp. I want the public to know what he did. I want them to see the footage. Reynolds looked up, his expression grim. Danielle, no, she interrupted. No more protecting him. No more protecting this system. If you won't release it, I will. Reynolds leaned back, studying her carefully. You know what happens if you do this. They'll paint you as a troublemaker. An angry black woman who's out for revenge. They'll make you the villain. Danielle's voice softened, but the fire in her eyes didn't fade. They already see me that way. But this isn't about me. This is about every person he's hurt, every person who didn't have the power to fight back. I'm not letting this go. Reynolds exhaled slowly. All right. But you need to be ready for what comes next. Danielle didn't hesitate. I've been ready. That afternoon, the footage went public. News outlets picked it up within hours, and soon it was everywhere, social media, television, headlines screaming about police misconduct and abuse of power. The backlash was immediate. Protesters gathered outside the station, demanding justice. Officers inside the building watched with mixed reactions, some angry, others uneasy. Danielle stayed calm, even as the tension around her reached a boiling point. She expected the threats, the stares, the isolation. She was ready for all of it. What she wasn't ready for was the message she received that night, a single text from an unknown number. You made a mistake. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She didn't respond. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, she set the phone down and looked out the window. She wasn't scared. She was angry. And anger was fuel. She had started this fight, and she wasn't going to stop until it was finished. Whatever came next, she'd be ready. Danielle's hands gripped the edges of the desk as the noise outside the station grew louder. The chants from protesters echoed through the walls, the rhythm of their voices pounding in her ears. She tried to focus on the stack of reports in front of her, but the tension in the room made it impossible. Officers shuffled past her office, their glances lingering longer than usual, their whispered conversations cutting off whenever she looked up. She knew what they were thinking. She could feel it, the resentment, the doubt, the fear. It didn't matter. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here to make sure that Watts faced the consequences of his actions. Reynolds appeared in the doorway, his expression tight. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him before speaking. It's getting worse out there. Reporters are camping outside the building. Protesters are blocking the entrance. The department's taking heat, and they're looking for someone to blame. Danielle leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. Let them look. I did my job. Reynolds's voice softened, but the tension didn't leave his posture. They're not just looking at what's anymore. They're looking at you. Danielle's eyes locked onto his. Then let them look at me. I have nothing to hide. Reynolds hesitated, then dropped a file onto her desk. She opened it, her stomach sinking as she scanned the pages. It wasn't about Watts. It was about her. Complaints she didn't even know existed, all vague, all strategically worded to create doubt. She looked up at Reynolds, her voice sharp. Where did this come from? Anonymous tips. But we both know where it really came from, Reynolds said, his tone low. They're trying to discredit you, trying to shift the focus off Watts and onto you. Danielle pushed the file away. This isn't going to work. The video speaks for itself. Reynolds leaned in, his voice dropping. Videos don't always matter as much as they should. Perception does. And right now, they're working overtime to turn the perception against you. Danielle stood, pacing the room as her pulse quickened. This is exactly why I didn't back down. This is what happens when people like Watts get protected for so long. They think they can rewrite the truth. Reynolds' voice softened. I know why you're doing this. And I know you're right. But you need to be careful. They're not playing fair, and if you're not ready for that, I'm ready, Danielle interrupted, her voice firm. I'm not backing down. Before Reynolds could respond, the door burst open, and a young officer stepped inside, his face pale. You need to come to the lobby. Now. Danielle and Reynolds exchanged a look before hurrying down the hallway. The noise grew louder as they approached, and the moment Danielle stepped into the open area, the tension hit her like a wave. Protesters pressed against the glass doors, their voices rising in anger. But it wasn't just them. On the other side of the room, a group of officers had gathered, their expressions dark. What stood among them? Danielle froze, her breath catching. He was supposed to be in custody. Supposed to be facing charges. Yet there he was, surrounded by his supporters, his presence radiating defiance. Reynolds stepped forward, his voice sharp. What the hell is this? Watts turned, his smirk returning. Freedom, he said, his voice loud enough to cut through the noise. Looks like the department decided the charges weren't going to stick after all. Danielle's heart pounded as she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. This isn't over, Watts. He turned to her, his eyes cold. Oh, it's over. You just don't know it yet. Reynolds grabbed her arm, pulling her back before she could respond. Not here, he said under his breath. Not now. Danielle didn't move. Her eyes locked onto Watts's, refusing to back down. But she knew Reynolds was right. The tension in the room was too high, the crowd too divided. This wasn't the place for a confrontation. She turned and walked out of the lobby, her hands trembling as she pushed through the doors into the hallway. Reynolds followed, his voice low but urgent. You can't let this get personal. Danielle spun to face him. It is personal. It was personal the moment he put his hands on me. The moment he looked at me like I didn't belong. Reynolds held her gaze, his expression softening. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You've already done more than most people would. But if you let this spiral, they'll win. Danielle's voice cracked, but she didn't back down. And what if they win anyway? Reynolds didn't have an answer. Danielle turned and walked away, her mind racing. She couldn't let this end here. She wouldn't let Watts walk away like nothing had happened. But the fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the entire system, the people who had protected him, the people who were still trying to silence her. Hours later, Danielle sat in her car, staring at the station from across the street. Her phone buzzed again, another unknown number. This time, she didn't answer. She already knew what it would say. She leaned back in her seat, her chest tight. The protesters were still there, their voices rising into the night. She closed her eyes, letting their chants echo in her ears. It wasn't over. Not yet. But she wasn't giving up. No matter what it took. Danielle paced the length of her living room, her phone pressed tightly against her ear as Reynolds's voice filled the space. His words were sharp, clipped, carrying the weight of something she already knew but didn't want to hear. Watts was out. Released without charges. The investigation had been declared inconclusive, and the footage that should have sealed his fate was suddenly being questioned. The narrative was shifting, faster than she could control it, and the department had already started closing ranks. She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to drown out the anger bubbling inside her chest. Reynolds's voice broke through her thoughts. I told you this wouldn't be easy. You're pushing against something bigger than one man. Danielle's voice was sharp when she cut him off. I know exactly what I'm pushing against, and I'm not stopping. Not now. Not ever. Reynolds sighed, and she could almost see him pinching the bridge of his nose the way he always did when he was stressed. You need to think this through, Danielle. They're coming after you. This isn't just about Watts anymore. They want to make an example out of you. Her grip on the phone tightened. Then let them try. I'm not afraid of them. The words left her mouth with more confidence than she felt, but she didn't have time for fear. Not when the walls were closing in. She ended the call and sank into the couch, her head falling into her hands as the weight of it all pressed down on her. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Reynolds. It was a message. One sentence. One threat. You should have stayed quiet. Her chest tightened as she stared at the screen. The next morning, Danielle walked into the station with her head high, but the tension was thicker than ever. Officers stopped talking when she passed, their eyes following her like she was a stranger in a place she had once belonged. She could feel it, the shift. She wasn't one of them anymore. Not to them. Reynolds met her in the hallway, his expression grim. He pulled her aside, lowering his voice even though the hallway was empty. They've filed a formal complaint against you. Excessive force, abuse of power, falsifying evidence. Danielle's breath caught, but she didn't let it show. That's ridiculous. They're desperate. Reynolds didn't flinch. Desperate doesn't mean they won't win. Danielle stepped back, her mind racing. It was happening faster than she'd expected, but she should have known. They weren't going to let her take Watts down without a fight, and now they were throwing everything they had at her. She straightened, her voice firm. Let them come. Reynolds grabbed her arm before she could walk away. Don't do this alone, Danielle. You need backup. You need people who can stand with you. She pulled free, shaking her head. I need to do this my way. Hours later, Danielle sat in an interrogation room, the walls pressing in as she faced the two investigators brought in to question her. They weren't from the department. They were outsiders, neutral, supposedly, but she could see the doubt in their eyes before they even asked the first question. One of them leaned forward, his voice smooth but sharp. Officer Carter, there have been allegations about your conduct during this investigation. We need to hear your side of the story. Danielle held his gaze, her voice steady. My side of the story is on the tape. Everything I did was by the book. The second investigator leaned back, crossing his arms. That's not how some people see it. They see an officer who pushed too hard, who let personal feelings get in the way of professionalism. Danielle's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice even. Personal feelings. I was assaulted in front of witnesses and on camera. That's not personal, that's factual. The first investigator scribbled something in his notebook, his expression unreadable. Even so, there are questions about whether you handled the aftermath appropriately. Danielle leaned forward, her eyes locked onto his. Appropriately? What part of this was ever appropriate? Being dragged to the ground in front of my son? Being threatened in my own workplace? Or watching this department protect a man who has no business wearing a badge. The room went quiet for a long moment before the second investigator spoke again. You need to understand the position you're in. The department's reputation is at stake here. Danielle's voice didn't waver. The department's reputation isn't my responsibility. The truth is. When the interview ended, Danielle walked out of the room feeling more exhausted than she had in weeks. Reynolds was waiting for her in the hallway, his expression hard to read. What did they say? Danielle shook her head. Nothing I didn't expect. He sighed. This isn't over. Not for them. Not for you. She met his eyes. It's never been over. The protests outside the station had grown larger, louder. News vans lined the streets, cameras flashing every time someone entered or left the building. Danielle stood at the window, watching as the crowd swelled. She saw faces she recognized, parents from the school, community leaders, strangers who had seen the footage and refused to stay silent. But she also saw the faces of officers who had stepped outside, their arms crossed, their expressions hard. It was a line being drawn, and Danielle was standing right in the middle of it. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a video. She opened it, her breath catching as Watts appeared on the screen, standing in front of a group of reporters, his voice calm and rehearsed. I've dedicated my career to serving this community, and now my name is being dragged through the mud by someone who's more interested in personal revenge than justice. This is a witch hunt, and I won't stand for it. Danielle's hands shook as she set the phone down. She could feel it slipping, the narrative, the momentum. He was playing the victim, and people were listening. She turned as Reynolds entered the room, his expression grim. You saw it? Danielle nodded. Yeah, I saw it. Reynolds hesitated. What are you going to do? Danielle's voice was quiet, but there was fire behind it. I'm going to finish what I started. Reynolds didn't argue. He just nodded and walked out, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She looked back at the window, her reflection staring back at her. This wasn't just about Watts anymore. It was about the system that let him get away with it. And she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Danielle stood at the podium, her fingers gripping its edges as the hum of voices in the crowd faded into silence. The cameras were rolling, their red lights blinking as reporters leaned in, waiting for her to speak. Outside the courthouse, the protesters had gathered again, their signs raised high, their chants echoing through the streets. But this time, it wasn't just anger that filled the air, it was hope. She took a slow breath, her heart steady as she looked out at the faces before her. This was the moment she had fought for, the moment they had tried to take from her. And now it was hers. She cleared her throat, her voice calm but strong as it carried through the room. Today is not just about one man or one incident. It's about accountability. It's about justice. It's about showing that no one, not even those who wear a badge, is above the law. For too long, this department, this system, has protected people like Bradley Watts. People who abuse their power, who use fear and intimidation to silence others. But today, that ends. The crowd erupted in applause, but Danielle raised her hand, bringing the room back to silence. She didn't want this moment to be drowned out by noise. She wanted every word to sink in. Bradley Watts believed he was untouchable. He believed his badge gave him the right to treat people however he wanted. But he was wrong. And today, he learned that. Her words hung in the air as she stepped back from the podium, letting the weight of them settle. As the crowd erupted again, she stepped down and walked through the sea of reporters, ignoring their shouted questions. Outside, the protesters cheered as she emerged, their voices blending into one. Danielle held her head high, her heart pounding as she pushed through the crowd and into the waiting car. Reynolds was there, waiting for her in the back seat, his expression softer than it had been in weeks. He didn't speak at first, just handed her a folder. She opened it, her breath catching as she scanned the papers inside. The charges against Watts were official now: criminal misconduct, assault, and falsifying reports. His resignation had been filed that morning, and his pension was gone. Danielle looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's done." Reynolds nodded, but there was a weight in his eyes that didn't match the victory. "It's done," he said, "but it's not over." Danielle met his gaze, and for the first time, she let herself smile. "No, it's not over. But it's a start." Watts sat alone in his apartment, the blinds drawn, the walls closing in around him. The television played in the background, the same footage looping over and over, the protests, Danielle's speech, his mugshot. He tried to tune it out, but the words cut through him. Disgraced. Fired. Charged. The phone on the table buzzed, but he didn't reach for it. He already knew what it would say. His lawyer's calls had become shorter, less hopeful, and the offers for reduced sentences were disappearing fast. He stood and walked to the window, peering out at the street below. People were still gathered outside, their signs waving in the air. His fists clenched at his sides as the anger boiled up again, but it was different now. It was hollow. The power he once held was gone, and he could feel it. He turned away from the window, sinking into the couch as the reality of it all settled over him. He had lost. Danielle stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked toward the building. The station was quieter than usual, the tension that had once filled the hallways now replaced by something else: respect. Officers stepped aside as she passed, their eyes meeting hers with something she hadn't seen before. Some of them still doubted her, still questioned her methods, but they no longer doubted her strength. She had earned their respect, and she wasn't about to let it go. Reynolds waited for her outside her office, his arms crossed as he leaned against the wall. "You did it," he said, but Danielle shook her head. "We did it." She pushed open the door, stepping inside and dropping her bag onto the desk. "But this isn't the end." Reynolds smiled, but there was a hint of exhaustion in his eyes. "It never is." Danielle sat down, her fingers brushing against the badge on her desk. She thought about Jamal, about the fear in his eyes that day at the school, and the strength he had shown since then. She thought about Watts, sitting alone in his apartment, and the people who had stood by him until the truth was too loud to ignore. Most of all, she thought about the people who had marched, who had chanted her name and refused to let her stand alone. This fight wasn't just hers, it was theirs. And it wasn't over. As the screen fades to black, I want you to think about what this story means. It's easy to believe that justice is guaranteed, that the truth always comes out. But the truth is, justice isn't automatic. It's fought for. It's demanded. And sometimes, it takes everything you have to make it happen. Danielle's story reminds us that speaking up isn't easy, especially when the system is designed to silence you. But it also reminds us that silence is never the answer. What would you have done in her place? Would you have fought as hard as she did? Or would the fear of losing everything have made you walk away? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Share your opinions, your experiences, and your own stories of standing up for what's right. And if this story moved you, if it made you think or question the world around you, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. We're here to tell the stories that matter, the stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what's worth fighting for. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And if you liked this one, give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.